Welcome to the TTT News Special. I'm DK Ross. Now, we are discussing a global student summit titled Vaccine Justice Through Fairness, Trust and Responsibility. It is being hosted in Trinidad and Tobago, and we are joined by two members of the steering committee, Carmen Romero, who has held multiple positions in student leadership at the local, national and European level, and Ms. Romero currently serves as the membership coordinator of the European Students' Union. We also have Amílcar Sanatan, who also represents Trinidad and Tobago in the Commonwealth Students Association. Mr. Sanatan is the chair of the upcoming Global Student Summit on Vaccine Justice. So we say thank you to both of you for making the time. And Carmen, we start off with you. Thank you. Asking for the premise. What's the premise of the summit?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for having me here together with Amílcar. And I think if there is something we've learned from the pandemic is that global emergencies required global actions and global solutions. And we as students are here to make our part. It is really important that this crisis that started as a health crisis, but now has economic, social, and political consequences, comes to an end, and comes to an end by doing the right things. So basically not leaving anyone behind. We need to put the focus on those ones that have been always forgotten by the authorities and by politicians and by governments. And we are here also to say that the students, we acknowledge that we need to be part of the solutions. We are the future generations, but the future is now. So this summit, that is, as you said, chaired by Amílcar, aims to gather students from all over the world to discuss how can we do our part? How can we basically ensure that no one is gonna be left behind?
And I want to bring you in, please, Amílcar, and ask to elaborate on that a little bit or expand on that, asking who are some of those hardest hit, some of the most vulnerable in a situation like this?
Most definitely, DK, and of course it's a pleasure to be here and share this information with the national community. Who are the hardest hit? Countries like our country in the global south. I'm talking about not one single dose in Haiti, to which we have scholars, multilateral agencies, international NGOs speaking about a vaccine apartheid, about the colonial attitudes to public health. The United Nations has already told us, and they made it very clear, that 75% of vaccine doses administered to date have taken place in 10 countries. The G7 recently met. They reaffirmed their commitment to the COVAX and vaccine distribution, but a lot of this is fueled by China and Russia's distribution, which is particularly happening in the Caribbean and the Americas. So this is a very serious global emergency, but it's also an interesting historical and political moment for which we need to see students play an important role and live up to the challenge of Martin Carter, the Guyanese poet. The more men of our time we are, the more our time is.
Especially when we can also quote a Martin Carter and say, these are the dark times, my love. But I want to ask the question though, because and in terms of having students step up to the challenge, and I leave this open to either of you to answer, what can students do, even before we get to the idea of what students are doing in this summit?
Do you want to go, Amílcar?
I will just quickly give a response and then Carmen could give way. What we see is that students, what they can do, are doing, and must do, is to take up a pro-vaccine position. That this is not something for debate among our student bodies. That universities have produced the research for vaccines all around the world to save and protect lives, and as student unions, organizations, and movements to get back to learning, to get back to school, we are saying that we take up a pro-vaccine position to raise awareness around our membership and school communities. But Carmen, you can go.
Yeah, I think it's well, as students have historically fight for basic rights to have a fair access to basic rights, and we do understand now that it is important to have a fair distribution and access to the vaccines. There are like many people like in the world that they are right now not having access, I feel that I have to say this. I'm Spanish, I'm European, of course, and I don't think Europe is doing enough. I don't think the global north is doing enough to help the global south. We have been historically harming the global south, and I think now students more than ever, we understand what is our role here. We are not just students, we're women, we're men, we're part of different minorities, and we fight as not just students, but also as part of societies that needs to keep on moving forward. And that's why students that have been, as I said, historically fighting to have basic rights and access to basic rights, we are still going to fight for having a fair distribution of vaccines and try to keep on moving forward, but not alone, but the whole world needs to do it.
But being able to look at a history, as you said, Carmen, be able to look at a history of inequity, that begs the question, what is vaccine diplomacy?
Well, vaccine diplomacy, if I could jump in to build on Carmen's serious expression about the sentiment that we see from our progressive colleagues and friends in Europe, this, this is vaccine diplomacy, where we have South Africa and India that has proposed a waiver on the intellectual property to the World Trade Organization to suspend patents on vaccines and medical equipment during COVID-19. Some countries are against it. Some countries are for it, like us. And in other countries, only change their minds when it is in their benefit. The role of big pharmaceutical companies profiting from a crisis is not new. We saw this with HIV/AIDS crisis, where millions were denied access because patents were protected. Vaccine diplomacy, places like the Caribbean, Central America, Latin America, we are not an imperial playground for countries to decide which countries they want to give vaccines to strategically to reap benefits in the 21st century and their goals. So we have to stand up as countries, not because we are economically poor, means we are politically defunct and have no contribution to make. We have very big contributions to make. And this is not about charity, this is about system change at the multilateral level. So the vaccine diplomacy is not just happening to us, but we are doing the work. And that is why Trinidad and Tobago, a global South country, is at the center of this Global Student Summit.
And we just saw our Prime Minister hand over the chair of CARICOM to Antigua Barbuda's Prime Minister Gaston Brown. But before he did that, and you reminded us that he said that we are to remind that we need the systems of fairness, caring, and sharing to work according to a plan so that we can all come out of this dreadful experience guided by principles of equity and compassion. So I want to ask both of you, I'll ask you first, please, Amílcar, and then go to Carmen, because there's some things I can't just ask one person. I need to get a sense from both of you. What are some of the long-term or short-term and long-term effects of this type of inequity? Because sometimes we just look at what is right in front of us, but we don't realize, okay, well, this action can have this effect a little down the road. So what are some of those things we need to be mindful of?
I would say just two issues that might be relevant to the student population right now are issues of malnutrition that is happening, where students are not the beneficiaries of national school feeding programs. In regions such as Africa, the Commonwealth has spoken out consistently on the need to ensure that children have their nutritional, the basic needs around their nutrition to be served. Another issue is the disruption to the education system, and that put a lot of people into a distance learning model effectively. And the gospel of educational technologies have been the most transformative thing we'll ever see. It has a lot of work to do, but we need to challenge this algorithmic capitalism, the proprietorship, where we have certain privatized educational companies that benefit off of this crisis. There's a lot of long-term work to do in financing education in a sustainable way for the most vulnerable. Carmen?
Yes, I think something really important, and this is not just a matter of students or education, is that historically we've been also like the world has already witnessed what was, for example, the Industrial Revolution and how that changed the world as we knew it. Now this pandemic has basically moved even more faster the technological revolution. Now everything is moving to online like fields of work and along, etc. And this is gonna create a lot of opportunities, but this is also gonna left behind a lot of people that used to work on things that now have been replaced by machines. So like, for example, in Spain, we're seeing how many shops have been closed because now everyone is buying online, because during a whole year people was forced to do that and now they are used to doing that. So basically they don't need shops anymore, or not certain kind of shops. So this kind of consequences are going to really have an impact on the way that we know the world right now and the way that societies work and the way that societies keep on progressing. So of course we need to keep in mind these kind of changes, because if we don't think in the social aspect of it, then we're gonna miss and leave behind a lot of people, and we cannot do that. We've like in the past economical crisis at the beginning of the 2000s, we saw the repercussions of certain kind of policies, and policies that, for example, in Europe were basically cutting on social rights. We cannot do that again. We should have learned from that, and we cannot just leave everything to the powers that have already everything under control.
And this is a
We
point that
are
I want to, and this is a point that I want to continue the conversation at with you, please, Carmen, when we return from this break. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are speaking with Amílcar Sanatan and Carmen Romero about a global student summit and looking at vaccine justice. And Carmen, just before we took the break, you were speaking about having one controlling factor ruling the narrative as it goes forward. And both you and Amílcar spoke to that, looking at the technological revolution and how that has been sped up so much more by the disruption of COVID-19. I can just imagine people who have shares in voice over internet protocols and things like Zoom, how they're laughing all the way to the bank. Even if they're not laughing, they're smiling heavily. But how important is it to have different stakeholders come forward to craft policy, craft change, and even have appropriate messaging on things like vaccines, looking at something that is informed and culturally sensitive? Because we might say the same thing, but it affects two individuals from different classes, different groups in a different sort of way.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, as the whole society of the world, that we have already suffered from this health crisis, we need to step up. We need to step up, understanding where are we and where are we going. And this means that we cannot just take care of the people that usually said that the authorities or the governments that said, let us take care of everything because we know what's going on and we know the solutions. In like I used to say when I was at university in Spain, if you don't do your politics, then someone is going to do it for you. And that someone cannot be in control of the things that you need, of your interest. And we as students, I think we have already understand the implications that this had on education. And this basically is going to happen everywhere. We have already seen it. We have witnessed the consequences of this crisis. So basically, I do encourage everyone to take a step and to do their part.
And in taking that step and doing that part, there are some things that sometimes we need to articulate and say, okay, well, this is what this means. And with that in mind, Amílcar, I'll ask you for a definition, another definition, thank you. How do you define vaccine justice?
Vaccine justice is a framework in which we ensure that the human rights of people are guaranteed, but we also have an equitable approach to the production, distribution, and the access to vaccines. And that is it might seem as a very small way to discuss a very complex set of processes, but vaccine justice is something we need to get young people to have at the tip of their lips to say vaccine justice. We talk about vaccine inequalities, well, we need vaccine justice. One of our colleagues from the Tobago Youth Council, Wilson, he said, vaccine justice is all our business. And that is the type of cultural sensitive messages. Vaccine is not just a medical thing that is going into you. It's about your idea of work, the timeline in which you start back work. It is the idea of about public health. And our approach is another idea about social workers and having social work models determine the way we engage communities. So vaccine justice is a big tent. And that is why at the Global Student Summit, and to your question that you asked, Carmen, TK, we have Public Services International making a contribution to our delegates, the International Federation of Social Workers, Caribbean Institute for Women in Leadership, the Media Institute of the Caribbean. As Carmen tried to reiterate, we are students, so our concern is not just about education. We are also members of society and the global community at large. And we believe we have a responsibility to convene and then move forward with a political agenda.
And you already started answering, and I'll ask you a question similar to what I did with Carmen. How does that tie into appropriate messaging, informed, culturally sensitive, positive messaging that builds trust in communities?
The first thing is to one, acknowledge that people's attitude towards vaccine happens on a spectrum. And people have legitimate reasons to be concerned about vaccine. If you don't want to take up a vaccine, it doesn't mean you're stupid, or as we say in Trinidad and Tobago, you're dotish, right? Is that you may have a hesitancy, which might be based on certain belief systems that exist, your understanding of the history of race and medical history. That is a serious issue. But we could also engage communities to meet them where they are and get gatekeepers to have it. One of the reasons I want my vaccine DK on a bacchanal level is that I want to eat doubles in the road again. Now that is a culturally sensitive message. So all students, youth, granny, and uncles who want to eat doubles standing up in the road again, because anything less than a doubles on the spot is an alupai, you need to take your vaccine. A society that is not vaccinated will have contraband doubles, and we won't be able to eat doubles stand up on the road. I'm sorry for using such a local specific reference to undermine Carmen, but I'll discuss that with her at the end of this interview.
But the thing though, is that I think this is what is needed. So like some people talk about, so we've learned the word jab. People talking about the jab. I prefer talking about the joke or the choke. And it's just how that message is put in and how we assimilate it. So I see Zinnia Chiwa is putting some messaging around the place in terms of take the jab. And that is actually something that I feel a little more comfortable looking at, regardless of whether or not the vaccine, I've allowed the vaccine to be administered and going forward like this. But we are at the end of this conversation. What I'll let you know though, this is part one. Part two, we're going to give you an idea of who are some of the people partnering with the summit, how you can engage with the summit, how you can let your voice be heard, how you can stand up and be counted. But Amílcar, Sanatan, and Carmen, Romero, we want to thank you so much for being part of part one and two to come. And we want to thank you for tuning into the TTT News Special.